Group.
Yeah. Minister,
order, please.
Minister, yesterday we learned that 3 people in 5 renting in Ireland have given up on ever owning their own home. We learned that half of Dublin tenants, half, are at fear of losing their home. Now, somehow this government has managed to preside over a housing crisis, a rental crisis, a homelessness crisis and a mortgage crisis all at the same time. 330,000 men, women and children today are living in homes in arrears. 330,000. Arrears over 2 years continue to rise and represent those most at risk of being in court and losing their homes. And Minister, after years of inaction, just a few weeks before the election, this week the Cabinet agreed to a bankruptcy change that can only be described as a quarter of what's needed 4 years too late. Now, last week, Minister, the Social Democrats published a comprehensive policy response to the mortgage crisis. It introduces 1-year bankruptcy with a maximum of an additional 2 years income attachment period. It includes a one-stop shop for borrowers providing free financial and legal expertise and representation. It includes a set of mandated solutions for borrowers should they qualify. It would allow courts refuse possession orders if it can be demonstrated that there is a sustainable solution to the mortgage to be had. And it includes a realistic way of scaling up the mortgage to rent scheme. The Minister, David Hall of the Irish Mortgage Holders Organisation, stated that in his opinion, working with borrowers and lenders every day, if the Social Democrats' proposals, which are all perfectly sensible and achievable, if they were implemented, the mortgage crisis would be over for those 330,000 people in 12 to 18 months. Now, Minister, you just stated that demonstrating leadership means a suite of policy proposals. I agree. So my question to you is this. Will you bring the Social Democrats' proposals to Cabinet and help end the mortgage crisis once and for all for 330,000 men, women and children living in fear and stress in this country?
Thank you, Deputy. Minister.
Well, I can't promise to bring the proposals of any party to Cabinet. I can't promise that. But what I will promise to do, and I think in the spirit of all of us working together as a Dáil, that I will certainly look at, and I'm sure we should all look at each other's proposals in the context of particularly the coming months, in terms of how we address these issues.
Please.
So the Deputy will be aware that the Government has agreed to bring forward legislation in relation to the bankruptcy period, and that will be done. And I congratulate my colleague, Deputy Penrose, for having brought that forward. I congratulate him for having done it as a genuine piece of legislation that will address the position faced by too many people as a consequence of the economic crash that we had to deal with in this country in the recent years. So the proposals that are contained in the Deputy's document, I have to admit that I haven't seen. I'm sorry about that, but I'll certainly read them, as I'm sure he'll read other parties' proposals in the coming months. But I think that this is it is necessary as we face into the closing weeks and the closing months of this Dáil to recognise the achievement of this government, to recognise the achievement of what has actually happened in this country, the greatest economic crisis, the greatest economic crash we had ever seen, a banking collapse on a scale that has never been seen anywhere in the world. The consequences of that in relation to the living standards of so many people, and particularly their opportunity to buy and own a home, have been enormous. And that this government's efforts since it was elected, since it came to office, has been to address the adverse consequences for so many people of the worst economic crash that we've ever seen in this country. And that's what we've been facing. If we haven't been quick enough to do it, If we haven't been quick enough to do it, we can deal with that and we can address it. If there are measures that we could have taken, a year before we took them or 6 months before we took them, we can have that debate. But nobody can actually gainsay the fact that this government, with Deputy Matthews' support for a little while until he went another direction, that this government did actually bring together not just the economy, but including the public finances, to ensure that we now have an economy that can actually look to the future and a society that can actually benefit from a stable economic environment. And that's what we now have for the first time in 7-8 years after the worst economic crash we've ever seen in our country. And I think that, insofar as the Deputy is advancing his own party proposals at leaders' questions, I think people will have to recognise that the two government parties, Fine Gael and Labour, have done an enormous amount to turn this country around.
Thank you. Deputy Stephen Donnelly, please, without interruptions, please. Deputy Stephen Donnelly.
Thank you, Minister. I welcome the fact that Cabinet has agreed to reduce bankruptcy. I tabled it in 2012 and the government voted against it. We tabled it after that, the government voted against it. So I recognise and I welcome the fact that the government has changed its position and it is now bringing it to 1 year. However, when we talk about recognising government achievements, when it comes to the mortgage crisis, the government's achievement is abject failure. And it gives me no pleasure to say that, Minister. Ireland's level of mortgage arrears is several times higher than other European countries that faced similar economic and housing challenges. Why? Because the government took a hands-off approach and said the banks have pretty much got to solve this themselves on a case-by-case basis. Every member of this House is helping constituents with mortgage arrears, and every member of this House knows that the first question you ask a borrower when they come in is, have you had financial advice? And most of them say, we can't afford financial advice. And then we will ask, have you had legal advice? Can you afford legal representation? And they'll say, we can't afford legal representation. If we could, we wouldn't be in mortgage arrears. And then we'll ask them, who's your lender? Because you and I, and every one of us knows, the answer to that question will largely determine whether or not the family is going to recover or be buried by a vindictive lender. And you and I, Minister, know that from our time in the Finance Committee together. So, the Social Democrats have a set of policy proposals. A one-stop shop for borrowers would provide financial and legal advice for free, and it could be set up now. MABS is in place. Other social sector organisations are in place. We don't need to wait for legislation. We don't need to wait for a new government next year to find its feet and figure out what it wants to do and negotiate a programme for government. This could be done now.
Thank you, Deputy.
Mandating a set of solutions, Minister, which would provide consistency and fairness could be done now. Fixing the mortgage to rent scheme could be done now. So, Minister, I know from my time working with you in the Finance Committee that you care about the mortgage crisis. But the sad reality is this government continues to keep its hands off and not act. Before the next election, you could bring in a one-stop shop, you could mandate a set of solutions, and you could scale up mortgage to rent. All of these things are possible. So my question, Minister, is, whilst I thank you for saying you will look at the proposals, before this doll falls, why not take a genuine position of leadership and implement measures we know will immediately help 330,000 men, women and children in this country?
Thank you. Minister, to conclude.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's completely untrue to say that the government took or has taken a hands-off approach to this problem. Manifestly not true. Now, the Deputy can disagree with some of the measures. The Deputy can disagree with some of the measures, and he can say that maybe they should have gone further, or that he disagrees with some approaches that were taken. But it's ludicrous to suggest that we've taken a hands-off approach. The entire effort of this government in the last 5 years has been to stabilise the economy after the shocking economic collapse that occurred. including, for example, in the cases of the impact on people with mortgages, mortgage arrears, including in relation to the insolvency legislation which we introduced and brought through the House, including in relation to things like MABs, and my understanding is that since September of this year, MABs have been more involved, have accelerated their efforts, for example, in relation to court mentoring and in relation to advice to individuals who are faced with these issues. So it's completely untrue to say that this is a hands-off approach. Now, the fact is that the arrears, people in arrears, the number of people in arrears, and generally family financial difficulties and household debt has reduced and is reducing. There's no question about that. And when the Deputy compares Ireland to other countries, he's not always comparing like with like, because he knows that the crash in this country was far more severe than it was in any of the other countries he could possibly find to compare us to. So the reality of it is that we have achieved an enormous amount, that we have stabilised the economy, that we have stabilised the public finances, and that there's hope now. There is hope for the people that the Deputy represents and that I represent, who have faced mortgage difficulties. They have hope. They can see hope. This government is giving them hope. That's what's happening. That's the actual specifics of the approach that this government has taken. That is what will continue to work for the Irish people, is government and politicians, and I include many politicians on both sides of this House, working genuinely in the interests of their individual constituents, yes, but also in the interests of the country, and in the interest of ensuring that we have proper measures in place that are robust, that we have an economy that works, and that the people of Ireland can actually profit from that.
Thank you. That concludes topical